So I'm going to shorten up some of the presentation so we can get through most of this. That's why I've included other videos for you. And this chapter is on memory. Memory, of course, is the basis of learning. Behaviorists measure whether you've learned something by whether you can reproduce the behavior, and we know that it's stored in the architecture of the synapses of the brain. Donald Hebb in the 1940s called them reverberating circuits. But keep in mind, this is before they had any technology to be able to actually discover this, which in fact they have since then. There are three phases of memory: encoding, storage, and retrieval. This is one of the study questions on the study sheet. Encoding is the first phase. If you use a computer analog, which psychologists often do, it includes the keyboard, the mouse, the scanner, a modem, any way of getting information from the periphery into the CPU. Storage, of course, nowadays it's the cloud. It could be a hard drive, a compact disk, a flash drive, any number of ways of storing the information if you use the computer analog. We know that the storage is in the cerebral cortex of the brain. And the third phase is called retrieval. That is, how do we get information out of this cerebral architecture? In the computer model, it would be through a directory and file system. Memory occurs on a continuum. It's seen to be like a skill. You have people on the far left that have amnesia. They have extremely limited capacity. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual calls these amnestic disorders. Sometimes it's caused by biological causes, which are more severe, and generally people don't recover from those unless it's something like a delirium from a fever. Or it could be a psychological amnesia, often called dissociative fugue or dissociative amnesia. There are people with eidetic memories that have large capacity for memory, seemingly photographic, if you will. Typically, people with photographic memories have memories for specific details or specific items, not for everything, and it's not necessarily associated with a high IQ. And then there's most of us in the middle with normal IQs or normal memory skills. The three types of memory, not the three phases, but the three types, include sensory memory, which is the briefest. In terms of storage capacity, it's enormous. Consider all the billions of receptors coming in from the periphery to the central nervous system. The good news, though, is that the duration is very, very brief. So the brain is able to acknowledge and disregard the vast majority of that information. Short-term memory, often called working memory, has a very limited capacity. A psychologist named Miller in the 1970s called them Miller sevens. It's 7 plus or minus 2 bits, and it can last anywhere from seconds to hours, depending on the amount of rehearsal that you use. With more processing, which is what happens as you go from sensory to long-term, you have relatively unlimited capacity. No one's ever really filled the brain up, and it can last a lifetime or less. Long-term memory is often divided into different types: procedural, semantic, and episodic. Procedural and semantic tend to have more in common than episodic, which tends to be very personal. So procedural includes how you do things, like using a can opener or cutting with a knife. Semantic tends to do with rules and language. And it varies from one culture to the next, the types of semantic rules that they use in language. Episodic, on the other hand, are very personal memories. So if you remember where you were when 9/11 happened, that would be an episodic memory. So there are ways that you can facilitate memory. They include memory aids, like flashcards or audio tapes, mnemonic devices like anagrams, or you're all familiar with the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, or the Great Lakes homes. Those are mnemonic devices. Rehearsal techniques, whether it's massed practice or spaced practice. Of course, spaced practice results in more retention than massed practice, like cramming. making things more elaborate and meaningful, doodling, annotating as you're reading, or making things distinctive. Sometimes state-dependent cues can help. So anyone who's ever been in a play and rehearsed on stage realizes that it's important to know your lines, rehearse your lines, where you use them. Chunking, which includes, instead of memorizing many different items all in a sequence, doing them in hunks or chunks. Spending time with it, called depth of processing. So if you don't spend time with information, it won't last very long. And of course, level of arousal. That is, if you are optimally aroused, or if you're over aroused or under aroused, retention drops off. There are factors that impair memory, including lack of cues, lack of meaningfulness and elaboration. Imagine reading a textbook with no pictures in it or diagrams. Not spending time with it, not rehearsing, not processing it. If you have brain damage, and of course, interference. Interference means that something is getting in the way of recalling the information. So the primacy effect refers to seeing items at the start of a list, and the recency effect includes things at the end of a list. If you memorize a list of presidents and do them in order, it's a good example of remembering who's at the start and who's at the end. Ebbinghaus discovered in the 1890s that if you don't rehearse the information after it's encoded, that your retention quickly drops off. And proactive and retroactive interference include interference from new material affecting retention of old material is retroactive interference. And proactive interference means that old material interferes with remembering new material.